It started on a crisp autumn night when the wind carried the scent of wet leaves and something older, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise. The kind of night where the sky itself feels too heavy, like it's holding its breath. I first heard the stories sitting around a fire with friends in the middle of the Adirondacks, the kind of remote place where cell service disappears and the world feels endless. Nobody believed each other at first, but the woods have a way of proving truths you don't want to accept. I want to tell you three stories that each began in the same way. Ordinary people, ordinary plans, stepping into the forest with nothing more than a backpack, a flashlight, and the illusion of safety. By the end, each of them learned the same lesson the hard way. The woods are alive with things you will never see coming. The first story belongs to a man named Ethan. Ethan was a city guy, thick glasses, a nervous laugh, the kind of person who could never quite ignore the rules. He had planned a weekend camping trip with his college buddies near the Catskills, determined to prove he was outdoorsy and brave. They arrived mid-afternoon, carrying tents, sleeping bags, and an overconfidence that only people from concrete jungles possess. The air smelled like pine, damp earth, and faint smoke from distant chimneys. The forest was alive with birds and the rustle of unseen animals. They set up their camp near a narrow creek, the kind that whispered and twisted like a living thing. Ethan insisted on taking a short hike before nightfall. His friends protested. They wanted to relax. But Ethan was insistent. He wanted a real adventure. With flashlights swinging like nervous eyes, they followed the trail deeper into the woods. The sky grew dim, shadows stretching across trees like fingers. Then Ethan noticed it, a tree, or maybe something worse, that had been marked strangely. Carvings, but not like initials or love notes, angular, jagged like teeth. He joked, "Looks like a warning." His friends laughed nervously, but the laughter didn't last long. Something shifted in the forest. The wind stopped, and the usual nighttime symphony went silent. Even the creek sounded distant, as if muted. That's when Ethan saw a figure, barely more than a silhouette, tall and thin, standing between the trees. Its head tilted unnaturally, and it didn't move like a person. It was waiting. Ethan froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He blinked, and the figure was closer. No sound, just the smell, like burning leaves and iron. One of his friends whispered, "Ethan, let's go." But when they turned, the trail was gone. The woods had shifted. Every tree looked the same, and every shadow seemed alive. Panic set in like a cold hand on their chests. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was unmeasurable. They wandered blindly until they stumbled back near their camp. But it wasn't their camp. The tents were gone, the fire pit just a circle of stones. And then Ethan realized something truly terrifying. None of them had remembered walking back. They were alone, not alone in the usual way, the way a hiker alone in the woods feels, but surrounded by a presence that was watching, waiting. Ethan swore he felt breath on the back of his neck. He turned and nothing, but the feeling remained. His friends screamed when they saw shadows moving behind the trees, stretching toward them like dark water. They ran. They ran until the forest spat them back onto a road, headlights piercing the night. They never spoke of it again. Ethan left the city not long after, but the nightmares didn't stop. He said he still wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling like he's being watched, feeling the brush of unseen fingers against his skin. The second story was even worse. Clara and her brother Jake were teens with a reckless streak, exploring abandoned areas near the forests of Vermont. The local legend spoke of a hermit, a man who lived deep in the woods, someone who had been alive for decades, who sometimes collected people. Kids dismissed it as a scary story until they heard the screams last summer. Clara didn't believe it. Jake dared her to prove it, and so they entered the forest at dusk, armed with nothing but curiosity and a sense of invincibility. The sun had dipped low, casting long, claw-like shadows across the forest floor. The trees were old, their branches tangled, twisting together like a cathedral of decay. They followed an old logging path that led to a clearing. There was a cabin, or the remains of one. It was nothing more than splintered wood and a crooked chimney, but something about it made their stomachs twist. The door creaked open, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the flashlight's beam. "Let's go in," Jake said, but Clara hesitated. Something in the air smelled wrong. Metal, rot, and an undercurrent of something alive. They stepped inside, and the floor groaned like a warning. Scraps of newspapers and torn fabric littered the ground. On the wall, scratched into the wood, were names, dates, some recent. Clara's breath caught. One of the names looked like hers. She wanted to scream, but Jake laughed it off. "It's just a joke." Then the cabin door slammed shut. Darkness enveloped them. The flashlight flickered. At first, it was just shadows playing tricks, but then shapes began to move, thin, unnerving, darting at the edges of light. A whispering voice, dry and brittle, echoed from the corners. "Why are you here?" it said. They ran, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, branches whipping their faces. The whisper followed them, echoing, always just out of sight. When they finally stumbled into a clearing, the cabin was gone, replaced by empty forest. Panic screamed in their veins. They tried to retrace their steps, but every path led them deeper into darkness. By the time they saw headlights from a passing car, they had been wandering for hours, yet it felt like days. Clara never returned to the woods. Jake didn't either. But she said something that stayed with everyone who heard her story. When you leave, the forest doesn't let go. You think you're safe, but it remembers, and sometimes it sends a reminder. The third story might be the worst of all. Marcus, a wildlife photographer, had been chasing a legend in Oregon's Cascade Mountains, a creature locals called the Woodman. Not Bigfoot, not entirely, but something tall, covered in dark matted hair, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Marcus was confident. He had gear, maps, GPS. He thought he could document it and return as a hero. He hiked into a dense part of the forest, the kind where sunlight barely touches the ground and moss carpets every surface. He set up cameras on tripods baited with food and waited. At night, he heard whispers, low and guttural, carried by the wind. Footsteps, heavy but silent, circled his camp. Marcus told himself it was deer or elk until he heard the snapping of branches overhead. He shone his flashlight up and froze. A figure hung in the trees, impossibly tall, limbs bent at wrong angles, eyes glowing amber. It dropped silently. Marcus froze. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his camera clicked on its own, capturing what no one would believe. The creature moved toward him. Marcus backed away, heart hammering, stumbling over roots and stones. He tripped, fell into a shallow creek, and the creature loomed over him. Its breath smelled like decay and wet soil. He swore he could hear it think, every movement deliberate. Marcus bolted, sprinting through the forest, hearing branches snap like bones behind him. He didn't stop until he reached his car, soaked, covered in cuts, barely breathing. The photographs showed a figure that could not exist. Tall, thin, impossibly elongated limbs, and eyes that seemed intelligent, aware. Marcus swore he had been marked, that the creature knew him. He said that even months later he felt its gaze. Sometimes at night he would hear a branch tapping at his window. Sometimes he would glimpse a tall shadow at the edge of the forest, watching. And that's the terrifying truth. Woods are not just empty spaces filled with trees. They are living, breathing entities, full of shadows and whispers, guardians and predators. Some may laugh at these stories, call them exaggeration, myth, or coincidence, but those who have felt it, who have stared into the dark and felt it stare back, know better. The air itself changes. The light bends strangely. You hear things that aren't there. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, something sees you and it doesn't forget. 3 ordinary people, 3 ordinary trips, all ended with the same lesson: the forest keeps its secrets. And some of those secrets hunt. So next time you think the woods are safe, remember Ethan, Clara, Jake, and Marcus. Remember the whispering shadows, the glowing eyes, the shifting trees. And remember this: sometimes it isn't the darkness you should fear. It's what lives in it. Because out there in the stillness, waiting, the woods are never empty. It began on a crisp autumn night that carried the scent of damp leaves, pine, and something older, something almost sentient, lurking beyond the firelight. The wind didn't just rustle the treetops, it whispered secrets, barely audible, curling into the ears of anyone who dared to listen. I remember that night vividly, even though I wasn't there myself. I heard it from people who had no reason to lie, who were terrified enough to remember every detail. And it started with 3 ordinary people, Ethan, Clara, and Marcus. Each of them thought they understood the woods. Each of them was wrong. Ethan's story. Ethan had always been a careful man, or at least he thought he was. His thick glasses magnified a nervous intensity that made him look perpetually alert. He and his 3 college friends arrived in the Catskills mid-afternoon, armed with tents, sleeping bags, and a misplaced sense of confidence. The air was rich with the smell of pine, moss, and a faint, smoky undertone that suggested someone else had been there before them. They laughed and joked the way young men do, but even Ethan felt a slight chill as he looked at the thick trees stretching toward the sky. After setting up camp near a narrow creek, Ethan insisted on a hike before nightfall. The trail was thin and twisting, the kind that disappears in the brush if you blink. Shadows fell across the path, stretching like fingers, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each step. His friends protested, but Ethan waved them off. He needed to prove something, not to them, but to himself. It wasn't long before he noticed the markings on a tree. Angular, jagged carvings, too deliberate to be random. "Looks like a warning," he joked, his voice too loud, cracking in the silence. The laughter from his friends didn't mask the unease that had already settled over them. The wind stopped entirely, as if the forest itself had taken a breath and held it. Birds went silent. The creek, which had murmured all afternoon, sounded distant. And then Ethan saw it, a tall, thin figure standing between the trees. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move like a person. It moved like a shadow, pretending to be human. Ethan froze, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure moved closer, not in the brisk, clumsy way a person does, but in deliberate, slow steps. There was a smell, iron, burnt leaves, and decay. And suddenly, the forest seemed to lean in around him. One of his friends whispered, "Ethan, let's go." But when they tried to retrace their steps, the path had vanished. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow was alive. Panic rose like bile in Ethan's throat. Time became meaningless. They wandered blindly, calling out to each other, but their voices were swallowed. When they stumbled near what they thought was their camp, it wasn't. The tents were gone. The fire pit was just a circle of stones. And then Ethan realized the terrifying truth. They hadn't been walking back. They had been walking deeper into the forest, and the forest had allowed them to return only when it was done playing with them. Clara and Jake. The second story unfolded in Vermont, in a place locals only whispered about. Clara and her brother Jake had grown up on urban legends of the forest hermit, a man said to live deep in the woods, taking those who dared to enter his territory. The stories were frightening enough that the local teens swore they were real, especially after hearing screaming the previous summer. Clara didn't believe it. Jake dared her to explore, and together they ventured in. The forest was old, tangled, oppressive. Every step they took made the underbrush crackle. Branches twisted above them, forming a dense, unnatural canopy that swallowed sunlight. They followed an abandoned logging trail that led to a clearing. At the center stood a dilapidated cabin, broken and leaning, with walls etched in deep scratches. Names and dates were carved into the wood, some recent. Clara's heart skipped a beat when she recognized her own name. Jake laughed nervously. "It's just someone's sick joke." Then the door slammed shut behind them, and darkness consumed them. Shapes flickered at the edges of their flashlight. A voice, dry and rasping, whispered, "Why are you here?" They bolted, crashing through the brush, roots twisting around their ankles. The whisper followed them, circling, relentless, until they finally broke into a clearing where the cabin had vanished. Hours, or what felt like days, had passed in minutes. They never returned to the forest, but Clara said something that haunts me still. The forest doesn't forget, and sometimes it sends reminders. Marcus. The third tale was the worst of all. Marcus, a wildlife photographer, had come to Oregon's Cascade Mountains in search of the woodman, a creature that locals insisted existed. Not Bigfoot, they said. Something older, something that knew the forest. Marcus set up cameras, baited with food, and waited. At night, whispers came, low and guttural, Heavy footsteps circled his camp. He told himself it was wildlife until he saw the figure above him, limbs bent at impossible angles, eyes glowing faint amber. The creature dropped silently. Its gaze locked onto Marcus. Every instinct screamed to run, but he fumbled for his camera, which clicked helplessly. The creature advanced, slow, deliberate, smelling of decay and wet earth. Marcus stumbled backward, falling into a shallow creek. Limbs slick, heart hammering, he fled, branches slashing his face. Only when he reached his car did he feel safe. Even then, he swore the eyes followed him. Ethan stumbled through the forest, his flashlight flickering in the thick darkness. The trees had somehow grown closer, branches twisting like skeletal hands that seemed to reach for him. Each step sank slightly into the damp earth, and every crack of a twig sounded like a gunshot.